So while there is no doubt in my mind that the universe has got a lot of mystery to it and we'll probably never know everything about it, chances are, here's some things that we probably can shed some light on from what we've seen, even from planets that are very close to the sun. And so here I give you at least 10 facts you might not know, in a way, about planet Mercury. So, the planet Mercury, from the distance between the sun and Mercury itself, is 33.853 million miles. Now, what does that mean? Now, basically what that means is that one day the sun is going to engulf Mercury, and Mercury is very close to the sun to the point where you can't really look at it without really looking towards the sun. If you really wanted to, like, kind of look at it through a telescope, you'd have to risk, like, looking at the sun during the day. It's very interesting, actually, how it's thrown off a little bit of what we know about it. So, observing it is very difficult, but there have been scientists that have found ways around this. And even though 33.353 million miles does seem like a big number, and it is, it at the same time, though, it kind of makes you wonder, at what point could the sun have been, like, what other objects could have been closest to Mercury? Is it possible the sun could have engulfed other planets, and Mercury wasn't necessarily the very first planet in the galaxy, or in the solar system? Now here's where it kind of gets really interesting. Mercury looks like the moon. How does a planet look exactly like a moon? Like, how do you get, like, classifications like this similar? Well, Mercury, much like the moon, has been geologically inactive, according to the science community, for billions of years. So what this means is, for a planet that has been that inactive for that many years and has been bombarded by asteroids despite its location from the nearest asteroid belt, which is the first asteroid belt in our solar system is between Mars and Jupiter, and it's still amazing how they still find a way to hit Mercury even towards... I wouldn't even be surprised if the sun even got hit by a couple of asteroids, but, being the sun, it'd just engulf it instead because it's just big ball of plasma. But what I find really interesting is, Mercury looks like the moon in the sense that it has no atmosphere. If it did have an atmosphere, it'd be completely different than what it is now. And it literally just looks like it's just been dried up, if there ever was anything ever there. Just the core, the rocky core of a unused planet, asteroid, and big giant ball of rock that eventually formed into a sphere because of its gravitational force in orbit. A lot of people don't know that. So it's interesting to think that with the known physics that we understand, or just the way things work in space, there's really different types of forces that really can result in some very interesting effects. Mercury is what is also known as an inferior planet. An inferior planet, by definition, there's two types of planets you could have. You got an inferior planet, and then you have, like, a superior planet. And basically what it has a lot to do with is it depends on, like, where the planet itself orbits, and it depends on, like, the orbit of, like, said other planet. And it can also, like, give it some advantages. For example, the planet Mercury is inferior to, like, planets like Venus and Earth because they come after it, or before it, basically. It depends on which way you want to look at it. If you're talking about, like, Mercury, it's like basically like the dependent and independent variable. Like the further out you go, the more superior planets seem to be because, like, they seem to help. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, if we were to say that Earth was inferior to Jupiter, for example, past Mars and all that, it's possible because, there have been scientists that have argued that, if it wasn't for Jupiter, like, pushing some of the asteroids out of its orbit, we wouldn't have had, like, some of the collisions that we've had on this planet. So basically, Jupiter helped out Earth. It's very possible that other planets could have helped out, other planets. But at the same time, though, they've gotten hit with so many asteroids, so many rocks, that they basically have the problems that they do right now. And so, in a way, an inferior planet would have probably gotten bombarded with so many so many physical contacts that it just formed the craters and all that we see, and it just slowly destroys its core over the years it's existed. And Jupiter, I mean, not just Jupiter, but Mercury is like basically within the orbit of the sun, within the orbit of the Earth's orbit. So it's interesting to think like how geology works. But when you really apply like simple geometry, like you have like all these different forces in space, all these, and mathematically like all these planets orbit the star, and the star is moving in space, and it even has its own like it's orbiting and its own it's accelerating and rotating and it can do stuff like on its own axis, and it's just all these multiple acceleration formulas that can cause all sorts of interesting results, whether in a galaxy, the universe, or said planet or solar system. Okay, and so number 4 is 28 degrees when viewed from the Earth. Now, if you're wondering what 28 degrees means, it's basically like, because I mentioned before, like, because Mercury is so close to the sun, you really basically are staring at the sun when you try to see Mercury from a telescope, if you can. I personally wouldn't know how to set it up personally, but the way it would work is you would be basically looking at a 28 degree based on where it would be located in the sun's rotation, rather, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, because we live in a third dimension, how we would perceive it, something like that. Basically, it's like where you would locate Mercury, with the sun being where it's at from where the Earth is at, where you'd be standing. And so it's really interesting to think that even with a 28 degree angle, the planet Mercury is still very close, not only close to the sun, but it's not going to be easy to see, because, I mean, even seeing Venus can be kind of difficult too, but you can still find Venus a lot easier than you could find the sun and Mercury. And so you really see just how close and how small these objects are. But yet you can see, like, it gives you the illusion in the sky. You can see the sun, and the sun's farther away than Mercury, but you can really see that the planet Mercury might be closer to Earth, but because it's so small, you can't see it with the naked eye. But because you see how big the sun is, you can really see how illusions can play out, and how things in the sky can really seem like they're different as far as the distance and the actual size of said object. So Mercury is tidally locked with the sun in a 3-2 spin to orbit renaissance. So basically, it states for like every 3 spins, it would do this every 2 times within the orbit. And so basically, it's kind of like this really interesting formula they find, where as Mercury is basically, orbiting around the sun, it's basically doesn't really orbit as fast. I mean, it orbits fast in its own way, but like the way it spins, it rotates on its own. It's very interesting, because the sun is like preventing it in its own way, but because everything hit it so many times, like in its own orbit, causes it varies like all these different speeds and all that. So it's interesting to think that, once again, with multiple types of forces and accelerations, you can get like different results on said objects. Now, here's one that I might have mentioned earlier, but I'll give a little more information on it. It's geologically inactive for billions of years. Now, Mercury, it's been debatable. You have a planet that has no atmosphere, or if it did, what did it really look like when it first formed? Could it have been a planet, but over the time, the only thing that really survived was its core? A good example, look at the moon, for example. Doesn't look like anything happened on the moon, but some people have speculated that it very well could have been the remains of another planet, a planet known as Thera. So if it's true, and I mean, granted, a billion years is a very long time, and that's enough time for things to change in gradually a long time period in space. We've learned this with a lot of planets. I'll give you another example. Jupiter was what is known as a failed star, despite its size and the elements it's made up of. You could see how a planet could have turned into something else over time. It's very possible. Same thing with Mercury. What happened to Mercury in the past? I mean, it doesn't look like it's a planet that's changed over time. It might have just orbited around the space and the sun, but it very well could have had like a very different past. But in order to really prove it, it's like we'd have to go back in time, or maybe go there and see if we can find fossils on its atmosphere somewhere, or surface rather. It's nothing but craters, and maybe something in the core, frozen ice maybe. There could be something in there. There's definitely reasons to believe there might be bacteria living on its atmosphere over time. I stated it might have had life in certain spots. There's certain things that scientists have found over time, like whether certain parts that are frozen, because some things on its planet haven't really changed. Like the dark side of Mercury could have still been the same for years because of it's like gravity locked. Again, like I said before, like it's inactive. It's been with that 2 to 3 spin out orbit ratio. It's very well that the bacteria, if it's very possible, I would like to say that if Mercury really does have life on it, it probably would have like the same kind of bacteria that you could find in space, to the point where it'd be like even bacteria weavable from what is like known as extreme acidophilies. The temperatures on Mercury, even though Mercury is like really close to the sun, its temperatures drop very drastically. The temperatures could be anywhere between roughly like 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it goes down to like negative. I think it's still a little under 180 degrees on the dark side. You see it basically drops like almost like 980 something degrees difference. However, it's still not the hottest planet though, because Venus is very hot and compressed atmosphere, which I'll explain in the next video that I make. Will explain like why that is, you know. But basically, Venus, in comparison, is really hot because it can trap more heat, and how compressed its atmosphere is, to the point where it's expanding out. And it's even bigger than the Earth now, based on its atmosphere expanding, which is really interesting. So, what I would like to say is, Mercury could have life on it in certain spots, because certain things could have evolved to handle said climates. And if that is the case, what does it say about the past? Is it very possible that Mercury might not have always been a planet? Maybe it came from somewhere else and then just got stuck in its orbit, you know, like what is known as like a rogue star or a rogue planet. What is that? What do we not know about it, you know, basically? So I think I'm pronouncing this wrong, but in 2025, we're going to be expected to be sending a BP Columbio probe to the planet, and we will be observing it for the 3rd time, I believe, and it's expected to arrive by 2025. So it'd be very interesting to see what they might discover about it. Has anything changed? How much farther does the sun look from the planet itself? And so far, Mercury has no moons around it, so that's pretty cool too. The probe itself is expected to do some comparisons, you know, maybe land on it, possibly. It's possible that landing on the planet is probably going to be more difficult than like landing on the moon, because they say that the surface of Mercury in comparison like to our moon is a lot more rough. But then again, I think any planet would be rough because, you know, you got like erosions. You could have, again, things chipping away at its atmosphere. It's very interesting. You know, comets, well, not just comets, but asteroids, meteorites, things flying in space tend to crash into things hard, and it unevens the planes. Really just looks like the Grand Canyon, but on another planet. And I personally think this is probably the best thing that I think I haven't mentioned yet, is that even though I've mentioned before that Mercury looks very identical to the moon in comparison, maybe the history behind it may actually make a lot more sense if this ends up being true. Basically, what ends up happening is there was this planet, Theia, that crash landed in Earth when it was still forming. Now, at the time when the Earth had collided, and this is probably going to be the hardest thing to explain, but try to imagine this, or if you have any questions about it, I'll be glad to explain it even further. But basically, you had this planet that crashed into another planet. So when the Earth was forming still, the rocks that, everything doesn't just start off as a sphere in space. It's all formed like through the gravity and the acceleration, and everything just eventually kind of forms and tightens and packs itself, and it just expands as time goes on. This is the case with planets, rocks, moons, and for example. So if we are to believe that these planets or these two physical objects collided with each other, there have been debates that the planet Theia may have very well have been the remains of the moon and the remains of the planet itself. But here's where it gets even more confusing. Now, depending on who you ask with this whole thing, it's very possible that when the planet Theia crashed into the Earth and it split in half, it wasn't just the remains of our moon, because of planet Theia. So in other words, it wouldn't have just been the remains of another planet. It's very possible, given the time. I mean, they've proven that our moon is the remains of another object, and it ended up in our gravity as, like, in the core, as it formed, because the core formed first as it went out, and then, over what was left over in the Earth's orbit as it formed, the moon started to form, so it eventually formed into the remains of Theia. But there was said to... But depending on who you ask, there are some scientists out there that believe that there could have been a second half of a moon of the remains of Theia. And if it's very possible, maybe that might be the remains of planet Mercury. It's still kind of debatable. And again, this is like one of those things that just like many other things, you would need like a time machine to go back in time and really see this. Is it, because how do you really prove this? Like, it's very possible if planet Theia might have had a second half that went flinging off, and then over time that eventually formed into another planet. Celestial objects in space like rocks, moons, they're pretty huge. So there's no doubt in my mind, given the right circumstances and the amount of time, you could form it into something else, like another planet. It's fair. So the way I would look at it is, if it was coming from the asteroid belt and it hit Earth, it's very possible that it might have went flying right past the Earth when it broke off, and then when it went flying in Venus's direction, probably got, dodged Venus, and it somehow got stuck between the sun, and then it just eventually the sun caught it, and it eventually just started orbiting really fast around it, and over time it just formed into Mercury. So if that is the case, it's very possible that the planet Mercury could have been the remains of another planet in this case. Hence the similarities. Some elements are the same. Actually, I think a lot of elements are the same, but I'll have to look up and do a size comparison of that. But the way I look at it, I wouldn't be surprised as of right now if the planet Mercury was in fact the remains of another planet, because it seems like, even in the universe, there's tons of things happening, and there's things that are just recyclable. It's just the way it is. So things are formed in space, and it's just another mystery lost in time. But it's something did truly happen. But what? So if you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something. If you like these kind of videos, I have a Patreon. You can support this channel if you want. You don't have to, but it'll inspire me to keep making more videos like this. If you want to do something about that, I'd appreciate the offer. If you want any requests, just let me know. I'll be glad to make videos, but hopefully if you find this educational, I will be glad to keep making more. So again, please subscribe, like this video, send it to people you know, and I'll see you in the next video.